Under a late-afternoon Texas sun, the asphalt shimmered like a warning. A security camera timestamp in the corner of the frame read 14:15:37. A pickup truck sat idling in a Lowe's parking lot, tailgate down, lumber stacked in the bed, ordinary, mundane, the sort of small errand that marks an ordinary life. Natasha Reeves closed the tailgate, wiped a film of dust from her hands, reached for the driver's door and paused. She had just come from a hardware aisle she knew well enough to navigate with a kind of efficiency learned under pressure. 2 tours in Afghanistan, an intelligence specialty, a bronze star pinned to a uniform for things most people never see. In the span of a breath, the day would stop being ordinary. 3 federal agents approached in formation, moving with a practiced coordination that made Natasha's chest tighten. They wore tactical vests. Their movements were purposeful, their voices measured. One of them stepped directly into the space between Natasha and her truck, his hand stopping where she reached for the door. The camera caught the moment in cold, indifferent clarity. The angle, the distance, the shadows. To anyone watching later in an air-conditioned courtroom, it would look like a still from a surveillance manual about containment. To Natasha, it was the beginning of an ordeal that would eventually force a federal agency to answer in public. "What are you doing here?" an agent demanded. They spoke of a targeted inquiry into document fraud, of a routine check. Natasha, steady and deliberate, said what she had rehearsed in quieter moments, that she was a United States citizen and a combat veteran, that she would not consent to an unlawful search or seizure. She activated her phone camera, set it on speaker, and placed a call to her attorney, Diana Velasquez of the Texas Civil Rights Project, who would listen in to the exchange. The microphone picked up her words and the agent's replies. The security camera and at least 2 body-worn cameras captured angles of the same encounter. Witnesses arrived, people pushing shopping carts, a bus driver, another customer who never expected to become a witness to a federal constitutional question. The agents pressed. Despite Natasha's insistence that she had not given them cause to detain or arrest her, they moved in, took her arms, and handcuffed her. The hold lasted 18 minutes. The cameras recorded each second. The footage would later show that the agents had no articulable facts amounting to reasonable suspicion, much less probable cause, the legal threshold required to transform a brief investigative stop into an arrest. Supervisor Thornton's voice would later be recorded on the radio telling the agents to stand down and release her. That would become a crucial admission in court, an agency supervisor acknowledging after the fact that the agents had no lawful basis to detain the woman in the parking lot. This is the core of the story. A decorated veteran, stopped and handcuffed in a public parking lot, and the tape that refused to be silent. But the significance runs deeper than one encounter. It is a portrait of how constitutional protections operate in real life when they are asserted, and when institutions are asked to answer for what their agents do in public. Natasha's military record was not a line on a resume in this case. It was how she carried herself in that confrontation. The training that served her on foreign soil, to stay calm while assessing threat, to document, to communicate, structured her response. She announced she was recording. She called her lawyer. She did not fight. She did not run. The recording device and the lawyer on the line became active witnesses, substitutes for the kind of immediate oversight that a civilian does not usually have at the scene of an encounter with federal agents. Before the cameras and the phone calls, there was the question the law asks at every stop. Did the officers have reasonable suspicion? Reasonable suspicion is a legal standard that permits a brief investigative stop when specific facts, taken together with rational inferences, suggest criminal activity may be afoot. It is a lower threshold than probable cause, which is required to make an arrest and means there is a fair probability that a person has committed a crime. In Natasha's case, the agents had neither. What they had instead was a pretext, an allegation of document fraud that, in the footage and in court, never materialized into articulable facts linking her to criminal conduct. When Natasha was released after Supervisor Thornton's order, she could have walked away and chosen privacy. She did not. She filed a complaint, and with Diana Velasquez's help, sued Immigration and Customs Enforcement and the three individual agents, Hayes, Morton, and Lynn, seeking redress for what she described as an unlawful seizure, excessive force, racial profiling, and selective enforcement. The lawsuit would set a chain of events into motion that turned a Lowe's parking lot into a stage for constitutional questions. The government's initial response to the claim was typical of many such cases. An offer of settlement intended to end the matter quietly. First, $50,000, then $200,000. Those numbers, presented in the sterile language of negotiation, felt to Natasha and her legal team less like a fair assessment of harm and more like an attempt to close a record that the cameras made indelible. They rejected the offers not out of stubbornness, but because the case implicated principles bigger than a private payout. If this kind of conduct could be paid away, what restraint would there be on future stops? What would prevent similar treatment of other veterans or other citizens? Discovery changed the dynamic. When the defense produced the security camera footage and the body-worn camera clips, the evidence crystallized. The courtroom would later replay the time-stamped footage, 14:15:37 on the security camera, as if the moment itself had a voice. The videos showed the containment formation, the agent's posture, Natasha's measured responses, the handcuffs biting into her wrists, the 30 seconds when she told the agent, "I am a United States citizen. I am a combat veteran." Words that seemed to split the scene into two narratives, the one unfolding in real time and the one that would be constructed in the courtroom. Pre-trial months were a study in procedural and public pressure. Veterans organizations rallied to Natasha's side, civil rights groups offered support, and local media began to pick up the story. The case became, in a way, a public lesson about the relationship between state power and individual rights. But underneath the civic theater were depositions, motions, and the careful exhibit marking that would determine how the jury would see what had happened. Diana Velasquez focused on preserving every clip, every radio transmission, every page of field training material. Among the exhibits she gathered were ICE training documents that emphasized the need for reasonable suspicion and warned against racial profiling. Documents the defense would not want made central to the jury's view of the facts, but that, when juxtaposed with the footage, spoke volumes. When the case went to trial 15 months after the parking lot incident, the courtroom felt full in a way that mattered. Members of the public, veterans, civil rights advocates, and ordinary citizens filled the gallery. The prosecution, as it were, was a civil claim. Not a criminal trial, but a demand that the state pay for what the jury would conclude was an unconstitutional seizure and an excessive use of force. The government's defense leaned on familiar lines. The agents acted in good faith. The split-second decisions of law enforcement deserve deference, and qualified immunity should protect officers who make reasonable but mistaken judgments about the law. Qualified immunity is a legal doctrine that can shield government officials from liability if their actions did not violate clearly established statutory or constitutional rights. It is often the first line of argument in civil suits against officers. In this trial, the defense argued that, even if the stop and the handcuffing were in some sense mistaken, the agents had not violated a clearly established right under controlling precedent. Velasquez's strategy was to show that the agents' conduct was not only unlawful, but clearly contrary to the policies and training that governed their actions. She needed to show the law was established enough that a reasonable officer would have known the stop was prohibited. The trial's emotional center was the footage. Judges often say that cameras are neutral machines. They do not lie, they only record. But cameras also require interpretation, angles, context, and voice. The jury watched the same 18 minutes the public would later see. They saw Natasha's phone on speaker with her attorney listening in. They heard the tone of the agent's questions and the calmness with which she responded. They saw her wrists reddening from the cuffs. They watched Supervisor Thornton's later acknowledgement on the agency's radio. They saw the absence of any documentary or verbalized justification that amounted to reasonable suspicion or probable cause. Natasha took the stand and testified not for spectacle, but to clarify the human story behind the grainy images. She recounted Afghanistan without pity, but with the matter-of-fact clarity that comes from having been trained to observe and remember. She described the Bronze Star not as a trophy, but as a marker of responsibilities carried over into civilian life. Watching, recording, not surrendering the small tools of oversight that had helped keep her and others safe in war zones. She explained why she called her attorney, and why she announced she was recording. She spoke of the ordinary indignities of the encounter, the handcuffs, the way strangers who watched with shopping carts felt the need to lean in, and of the shock of being treated like a suspect when she had done nothing more than buy wood for a project in her driveway. Defense witnesses tried to paint the operation as textured and complicated, a routine immigration enforcement action that required split-second judgment. But the cross-examination and exhibits cut through ambiguity. A supervisor's deposition and live testimony under oath conceded that agents had no probable cause and, as the jury would see, no articulable reasonable suspicion. The agency's training materials, produced into evidence by Velasquez, were read aloud in court, highlighting the clear directive that officers should avoid detaining individuals absent facts that reasonable suspicion requires. When these materials were placed beside the parking lot footage, the jury could not help but see the dissonance between policy and practice. Throughout the trial, the motif of surveillance circled like a refrain. The parking lot camera's timestamp, a banal digital readout, became a narrative device and a symbol, time-stamped truth. The body-worn cameras, intended as tools of accountability, documented the agent's own versions of events, and contradicted what little justification they offered in the moment. The radio transmission from Supervisor Thornton ordering release was an admission that crystallized the plaintiff's claim. The agency's own chain of command acknowledged that the detention had no lawful foundation. To the jury, these recordings did what documents and testimony sometimes fail to do. They presented a sequence of moments that, taken together, created an unmistakable pattern. After days of testimony and evidence, the case moved to the jury for deliberation. They retired and considered not just a private wrong, but a public wrong, the consequence of federal power deployed without the checks the Constitution demands. The jury returned after 6 days. In a small, saturated moment that registered in the hallowed stillness of the courtroom, the forewoman read the verdict aloud. "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." Those words carried a legal result and a moral judgment. For Natasha, for the witnesses who had watched, for the community of veterans and civil rights advocates who had followed the case, the verdict closed a chapter on institutional deniability. The damages phase that followed quantified harm. The jury awarded $4.3 million in compensatory damages, an amount intended to account for the injury to Natasha's dignity, the pain from the physical restraint, and the emotional consequences of being treated as a suspect in public. In addition, the jury awarded $3 million in punitive damages, reflecting the jury's judgment that the agent's conduct was sufficiently egregious to warrant punishment beyond compensation and to deter similar behavior in the future. The grand total, $7.6 million, would reverberate beyond the courtroom as a rare financial reckoning with federal misconduct. Personnel consequences followed in a way the jury's verdict alone could not create, but the public record then enforced. Agent Hayes, the lead agent, was terminated from his position. Agent Morton resigned. Agent Lynn was reassigned. Supervisor Thornton faced internal scrutiny for his orders and the way those earlier chain-of-command decisions had played out. ICE's San Antonio field office conducted an internal review and clarified certain policies and training to emphasize the legal standards for stops and arrests, and to address racial profiling concerns identified in the lawsuit and the public record. These steps were neither a blanket vindication nor the end of systemic debates, but they were concrete institutional reactions to a moment captured on tape. The public impact was immediate, and in some ways, structural. Natasha used the settlement and the moral authority of her victory to found the Veterans Rights Defense Fund, a nonprofit dedicated to offering legal support and education to veterans who faced discrimination by law enforcement. Her goal was not retribution, but a system that could learn, to make legal representation accessible to those whose military service did not shield them from the vulnerabilities of civilian life, to ensure that the tools Natasha used, documentation, counsel, and public witness, would be available to others. The fund partnered with civil rights organizations and local veteran groups. Natcha's story, once replayed on news programs and discussed in community forums, became a case study in both civic empowerment and the limits of power when unchecked. There are lessons and caveats in this narrative. Cameras do not guarantee justice. They are part of a constellation of evidence that must be preserved, interpreted, and argued. A recording can clarify a moment, but cannot by itself make a legal claim succeed. Natasha's case was successful because the video reinforced a legal theory, because disclosures during discovery assembled a narrative that could not be plausibly denied, and because a jury found the combination compelling enough to return a verdict for the plaintiff. The case also underscores the role of counsel in the courts. Courts, when functioning, provide a forum in which the balance between state authority and individual rights can be examined and, sometimes, restored. The human cost should not be forgotten. 18 minutes handcuffed in a public space left more than redness on the wrists. It left a sense of violation, of betrayal by an institution that Natasha had served with valor. Her testimony about being a veteran was not a plea for special treatment. It was a reminder that service to a nation does not inoculate one from constitutional insult. It was a stark juxtaposition. She had once watched over others, and now she was watched by the state itself. The case posed the unsettling question at the heart of many civil rights struggles. What happens when the state uses its power against those who have served it? Throughout the litigation, Natasha's posture remained resolute but not vindictive. The public saw her not as someone seeking headlines, but as someone pressing for an account to be settled. An institutional acknowledgement that the seals of power do not make conduct lawful when it violates the Fourth Amendment. That legal principle, protecting citizens against unreasonable searches and seizures, shaped the legal claims, and ultimately, the jury's decision. The trial did not aim to criminally punish the agents beyond the consequences an employer might impose. It aimed to make the government answer in damages under civil law for a constitutional violation. The aftermath also sparked conversations about training and accountability within federal agencies. ICE's local field office instituted clarifications to training materials and emphasized the standards that officers must follow. Training that already specified the need for reasonable suspicion and the avoidance of racial profiling was re-emphasized. Those changes were administrative, not sweeping reforms, and should be understood as the kind of incremental adjustments that often follow high-profile litigation. They are not cures for systemic problems. They are corrections in an institutional process that had permitted an overreaching stop to occur. The jury's punitive award also had a signaling effect. Punitive damages in civil rights cases are rare and reserved for conduct that a jury finds particularly harmful. In this instance, the jury's decision to add $3.3 million in punitive damages reflected a collective judgment that the agent's actions were not just mistaken, but sufficiently harmful as to warrant an additional deterrent. The monetary figure is consequential, but its symbolic weight may be larger still. That an act of unconstitutional conduct by federal agents could lead to both compensation and punishment sends a message about the legal consequences of violating citizens' rights. When the cameras rolled inside the courtroom and the films of that parking lot encounter filled the screen, the public was watching more than a single incident. They watched a process unfold in which evidence, testimony, and law interacted to produce an outcome that reaffirmed constitutional limits on government power. The verdict did not rewrite the law, nor did it promise a universal remedy for every similar encounter. But it did establish a public accountability moment. A decorated veteran had been unlawfully detained, the evidence showed it, a jury concluded it, and the state was ordered to pay a substantial judgment. The case became a precedent in the moral and political sense, an instance where institutional power faced public scrutiny and consequence. The rest of the story is about what comes after vindication. For Natasha, winning the case did not simply close a chapter, it opened a new project. The Veterans Rights Defense Fund offers legal help to veterans who encounter potential civil rights violations, educates city and county agencies about best practices when interacting with veterans, and partners with nonpartisan groups like the American Civil Liberties Union and local veteran organizations to produce civic education materials. Natasha's aim was practical: to use the resources and visibility yielded by the verdict to help those who would otherwise be isolated when confronted with the intimidating presence of federal enforcement. Her approach to advocacy echoes how she behaved in the parking lot. It is methodical, precise, and aimed at changing systems rather than individuals. She increasingly speaks at community forums, sharing not legal strategies but stories about documentation, witnesses, and the availability of civil processes. She insists on the limits of any single tactic. Cameras can help, counsel matters, but each encounter is unique. Her message is anchored to a larger civic lesson. Rights are only meaningful if citizens know them, assert them, and if institutions can be compelled to answer through transparent processes. The parking lot camera, the timestamp, the 18 minutes, all remain artifacts of the event. In the Fund's inaugural video, that same timestamp flashes across the screen as a pedagogical device, a moment to study, to question, to learn. Natasha uses the footage not to inflame but to instruct: how evidence becomes public, how bystanders can become witnesses, how institutions respond when their agents are put on public trial. The Fund organizes clinics and partner workshops that focus on documentation, legal options, and the civil remedies available, not as a set of commands, but as a map of possible recourse for those caught in similar circumstances. There is a quiet irony at the heart of the story. A woman who had spent years navigating the fog of war returned to her country and found herself entangled in a different kind of fog: procedural ambiguity and the raw assertion of authority without constitutional grounding. Yet the tools that helped preserve life abroad, discipline, documentation, a sense of duty, also equipped her to challenge that authority. The videotape that would later be played in a courtroom belonged to a mundane security system, but it became a civic instrument, translating a fleeting encounter into public evidence that could be examined and judged. Natasha's victory was not the end of debate about law enforcement practices or federal enforcement priorities. It was neither a panacea nor a universal condemnation, but it did accomplish several concrete things. It provided a legal remedy for a clearly documented wrong. It resulted in personnel consequences for the agents involved. It triggered an internal ICE review and training clarifications. And it produced a philanthropic initiative designed to help others navigate the interface between service and citizenship. In those specific ways, the case mattered. The story also raises broader questions for a democratic society. What do we expect from public servants vested with coercive power? How should institutions respond when their agents overstep? And what role do ordinary citizens play in sustaining constitutional checks and balances? Natasha's case suggests that answers begin, often with documentation and a willingness to press charges in civil court when appropriate. It also shows that public engagement, watchful communities, legal organizations, and media amplifies the corrective power of law. In the end, the courtroom's most resonant moment was not the dollar figure. It was the jury's clear finding on the record: "We find in favor of the plaintiff on all counts." That declaration restored, in a specific instance, the balance between state authority and individual liberty. It affirmed that even federal agents are answerable when they cross constitutional lines. It demonstrated that a single moment of courage, combined with public evidence and persistent legal advocacy, can produce institutional accountability. Natasha's story did not end with the check. She now spends her days splitting time between running the Veterans Rights Defense Fund and advocating for tempered enforcement practices that respect veterans and civilians alike. The fund's work is modest in scale, but purposeful, offering legal representation in civil rights cases, hosting community education events, and partnering with local veteran groups to offer legal clinics. The aim is to ensure that others have access to the same tools that proved decisive in her case. Tools that, in her experience, made a difference in a public parking lot and then in a courtroom. At the most human level, the victory returned something intangible to Natasha, a sense that wrongs could be acknowledged, that public processes could repair harm, and that service to country need not be met with suspicion. More collectively, the case became an argument in practice for the rule of law, that the Fourth Amendment protects ordinary life as much as it constrains extraordinary power. If this account speaks to you, if the image of a security camera timestamp and a veteran's calm refusal to be silenced resonates, there are ways to stay engaged. Learn about organizations working on these issues, consider supporting community legal services, and follow the Veterans Rights Defense Fund to see how the resources from this verdict are being deployed to help others. The story of Natasha Reeves is a story about rights, cameras, law, and a jury that, after careful deliberation, held the government to account. It is a reminder that the protections enshrined in the Constitution are not abstractions. They are tools citizens can and must use to preserve dignity and liberty in everyday life. What would you do if someone you love were stopped in a parking lot like that? How would you want institutions to respond? These are the civic questions that linger after the cameras stop rolling. Learn more about the Veterans Rights Defense Fund and how to support veterans who face discrimination. Link in the description.